my book came in the mail today.
Oh, really?
I ordered it on November 22nd, and I got it in the mail today.
Where'd you order it from? Black Lawrence?
I ordered it on Amazon used because the everything else said it probably said not available until December 15th. But then said that I thought buying a used book I'd get it quicker, but I didn't.
Wow. Huh. Well, Lisa is going to join us at 8 o'clock.
Great.
If we have questions, we can ask her, and I'm going to ask her to read a poem to finish us off too.
That's great.
But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm interested in what you guys think about the cover of this book.
It's Helga's favorite color.
Well, it's not a mosaic and it's not dark.
No.
It's just kind of a meh cover to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very green.
Blue.
Really noticed it, except for the color's nice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Underwhelming.
Yeah, very, very underwhelming. I'm sure she probably didn't have a lot of say in the cover. Maybe she did, but sometimes you don't. But I don't know. I thought there was an opportunity to do more with the cover.
Yeah.
I know the title seems to just call for it, right? It's very visual.
Yeah. So I thought it was interesting.
There's a lot of rain in the book. Maybe it's an abstract rendering of a rainy scene.
The title of the painting that she used says undersea, wait a minute.
Landscape, undersea landscape.
Landscape. So I think undersea kind of goes with the content, but it's not obvious.
I missed that. I didn't see the undersea until you just pointed it out.
I did see that, and I wondered, I had forgotten about it till now, and I wondered maybe Jill Samuels is a friend or something.
Yeah, that could be. Could be too.
Because there's so much religious connotation in the book. Right, there could be so many other possibilities.
Yeah. I don't know, like, because I'm very visual, like I would pick up a book because its cover is interesting.
Yeah.
And this is a book that I would pass by probably. But I knew Lisa, so I didn't, but it's just interesting how those choices are made sometimes. Well, looking at the structure of the book and the contents and the sections, what did you think about that?
They're very short sections.
Yeah.
Right.
I was surprised the section could be just 2 poems, a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in the sections, there is a definite religious undertone, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like an order of service.
Testament and.
Well, do you think she was that she wasn't so worried about how many poems were in them, but she was trying to get that magic 7, because there are 7 sections.
7 is a godly number, yes.
Yeah.
Since it has a lot of religious
Undertones.
undertones, I thought maybe that was why.
And she has a master's in divinity.
Yeah.
Saw that. She uses, a lot of couplets, not every poem, but most of the poems she has couplets.
Did you have a favorite section? Or did you think about it in those terms about how they're working together, those sections?
Maybe survival.
Yeah.
Survival.
That would have been mine too.
I thought the sections were pretty tight. They were focused. The poems that were in the sections seemed to be the poems that should be in the sections. like all the ones in survival should be there. I mean,
So we were talking earlier about that, how this book seems to follow a nice arc or a timeline more carefully than perhaps some of the other books that we've read. You know, starting with commemoration and the child looking back poems, and then the mother poems, and then the kind of, I don't know, uncertainty of growing up and knowing that you weren't like everybody else, and, you know, that kind of thing. And then kind of coming to terms with it through testament, especially the lies that save us, even though you're still hiding a little bit. And then the last two sections were different for me, but I liked them. Like, I like both poems in This Is Praying, but it was kind of an offshoot into a kind of a different land, which I want to ask her about, because she probably has an interesting thing to say about those two poems. And then Mosaic of the Dark. Actually, Mosaic of the Dark had a couple of poems that I don't know, I got a little confused with, that I didn't really follow well.
Yeah. I had read in an interview with her that I think she was second guessing about putting the weaker poems toward the back. She said that she would rethink that if she had a chance to do it over again.
Really?
And I wondered if she was referring to those particular poems in the back of this manuscript.
That's interesting.
And
I like the history of rain, though.
Yes, I did like that one.
I heard somebody say one time that there are there can be personal poems and private poems, and I feel like some of the ones, like, and personal ones are ones that are true for you, but that also speak to other people, and the private ones are ones that if they aren't in the know about something in your life, they might not get what you're saying. And I feel like a few of these poems were private poems, and I felt like I was on the outside and I was trying to get it, and I was just like, there's something I'm missing.
Yes, I felt a lot of those poems were like that. But, you know, Stevie Nicks writes a lot of private lyrics. You know, like, what the heck is Stevie Nicks talking about? But I mean, her stuff is gorgeous. But yeah, I marked a lot of lines where I just went, huh? What? I just don't know what she's talking about. It's just way too interior. She's not dropping enough clues for the reader for me.
Yeah.
She makes a lot of leaps, like the one early on about the famous poet, the elevator ride with famous poet. She leaps to her father, which is wonderful. I love what she's saying, but then she leaps even further.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how it goes back to that initial meeting in
Yes.
the elevator.
My note for that is, this poem tries too hard to make profound leaps. That's my note on this poem.
It's all really interesting, but you're saying, okay, now where am I leaping next?
And who is the poet? I kept thinking, which poet that would have been alive around this time wrote a famous poem about rain, maybe. I was thinking, a rain poem. And I even Googled it.
We'll have to ask her. I'll have to remember to ask her that.
But I do love how she comes at things slant. She does that really well, I think, in so many cases. And I admire that greatly. And she uses such a light touch also.
She does.
I also admire.
You know, one thing that I think, going back to the last two sections, is that the last poem, which is Even Houseflies, which is an interesting poem to end the book. So that's where the title of the book comes from, the very last line of the very last poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And interesting that Mosaic of the Dark is referring to the eyes which are
Mhm.
seeing, the sight organs, and need light. So there's the really cool juxtaposition, I think, there with that title and that in that poem. And how
I
it
got a
looks in the
sense
whole
that
book.
poem was also about her mother. And I don't know why I think that.
Well, like my mother who won't
Yeah.
stay dead.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But also like physically, like maybe finding the body of the mother, maybe.
Mm.
And there were flies in the house then.
Hmm.
There's so much restriction in this book. Restriction, trying to be a good girl, being how she was raised, how she was taught to speak a certain way and be a certain way and be so confined with that. And I really identify with that
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah. That brings us to themes. So we have that. We have this the mother. I thought it was interesting. What was being said was that the mother was perhaps had queerness about her as well, but she never, it wasn't allowed
Right.
back then. So she was not her full authentic self. And one of the poems that's probably my favorite poem in the book, is on page 25, Wedding.
Yes, me too.
That poem I thought was just stellar.
Yeah.
Especially there in that moment of keeping and quiet breaking, and the gospel slinked in by the preacher, an appeal to the rightness of the past. As I said, I do with almost every cell, and in the process began the long and tight-lipped death of my mother who taught me how. I
Yeah.
thought that was
Ooh,
power,
right.
beautiful, wrenching poem, heart-wrenching
Yes.
poem.
Yes. I marked that as a favorite, one of my favorites.
Yeah. What else did you have as your favorites?
Well, I was rereading this afternoon, and I had a question. I was thinking, it was maybe a question we could ask of any book, but what's the poem in this book that you hadn't read before, or that hadn't been written before?
Mm.
I don't know if you have. I mean, I think I have at least one option, but I wondered if that would be anything. Something leaps to mind immediately.
The one on page 43, I'm not sure how to say that.
Yes.
It doesn't feel like it quite belongs, but yet it does. And it's so wrenching and striking. It kind of blows me away.
That was the one that I couldn't quite.
With it, Sandy. I was going along with it, Sandy, until she got to the human intestine. I thought, where the heck did that come from?
Me too.
If she stopped with, if dark matter could draw, it would not draw itself. I thought, okay, that might be a pretty good clincher, but she kept going. And I thought, what? What woman? I don't know. That, that second page there, when I turned the page, I thought, what is the rest of this here? I don't know.
Well, she gives you a little bit in her epigraph, and we know about all the violence against women in India, especially.
It seemed to, a transgression. A woman outside of the bounds of what would be acceptable, and then being punished or being killed for it. So in that sense, I mean, to me, it fit the book. Its presence there was a kind of extreme of this.
Yes.
I guess I was trying to pull in the film Life of Pi,
Mm-hmm.
which it works in the beginning.
I was trying to figure out the woman at the end, and I was like, is that the 23-year-old woman on the bus? And
Yeah.
and why did she die? You know, I'm in my help. Maybe I should have looked up Eminat. I didn't look it up, and I should have.
Where are you seeing that she died? Where's this note that you guys are looking at? I don't see
Well,
the
the
note.
epigraph talks about the
epigraph.
23-year-old student, but the very last line of the poem says that the woman, it was said, died peacefully. So I'm just trying to connect who the woman.
Oh, you think it's one and the same?
I don't know. That's why I was like you. I was trying to figure out where this woman came into play.
I mean, I see her as the same person, and that's why the human intestines come in. You know, only 5% of hers would remain.
Exactly.
You know, so I see the real violence that's happened against her. And then the way in which we name things, you know, I mean, they were called joy riders.
Instead of gang rapers, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are other words for what this is, and just as there's maybe a different word than died peacefully. And in that sense, going back to the Life of Pi, trying to remember that myself, all the different things that are in the boat, right?
Yeah.
And which one wins out, I guess.
Been a
And
while.
if you see the bus as a kind of boat on land.
Yeah, there's a lot of human anatomy in the Life of Pi, where, I mean, people die and, you know, there are entrails and he's drying things to try to stay alive, to eat, to stay alive. And, you know, it's anything but a joyride, but
Well, it's like two horror stories. Cruelty.
I thought at least a poem for me that I didn't think I had read before, or that I wasn't sure who had written something like it before, would be This is Praying on page 53.
Mm-hmm.
When she visits the
Yeah.
resident at Riverbend, maximum security. I thought that's a very rich poem.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you see it as a kind of also a larger metaphor for people who are incarcerated or trapped, or, you know, the ways in which we're in our bodies, and,
Right.
you know, some things are illegal. And
Yeah.
I mean, my wife and I are watching for the first time the movie Loving, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we haven't finished it. We started it yesterday, but we didn't finish it because kids came in. But hey, it's like, this was illegal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I paid a lot of attention to that poem. I thought that was a pretty strong poem, but
Yeah.
right toward the end there's a little section, bit of a stanza there where I felt like she could have left that out. Not a voice exactly, more like a gentle pressing of heat, the perfect distance from flame, settling me immediately into sleep. And I just went, what? Where does the heat and the flame come into this? But the rest of it, you know, hearing him breathing and telling him it's a beautiful sound. I like the way she closed that. But sometimes some of her leaps, some of her images and the thing, I don't know about that.
I thought that might hark back to the part where it says, I imagine his organs, his bones liquefying inside of his skin. I mean, I think she's imagining his execution and the heat and the fire of that, the electric chair, perhaps. That was the connection I made. But.
Okay. Is it liquefying or is it heating? I don't know. Is it mixed? Is that a mixed metaphor there? Oh.
I don't know.
His organs, his bones liquefying inside of his skin. All right.
I mean, that might not be the right connection.
Yeah, I also thought she was imagining his being put to death there with the liquefying inside of his skin, but but why would that settle her into sleep? That sounds more positive. That image sounds positive, more positive than negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Sometimes when I read something like that and I can't connect it, then I just make my own leap right past it. I'm like, well, I really like the ending. I love the ending. I don't have to figure out that heat part.
You know, what I do, Sandy, is I put the poem away and then I come back to it 7 years later and I go, what the heck was I thinking? And I cross it out.
I like this.
My poems are 7 lines rather than 40. Go ahead.
What'd you say, Annette?
I just thought there were a lot of strong pieces in this poem. Lots of strong lines through it. I did like it. It was a little bit. I was a little bit unclear though in the part you're talking about at the end.
I think I read that as just that space between them as she's talking to him through this small pie hole or whatever it's called. And so there's just that sense of that distance between them that maybe has some measure of heat. It's a voice coming up out of that.
And it's low to the ground too, right? It's like, didn't she say it was like 9 inches from the ground or something?
8
like
inches from the bottom of the door.
Isn't that strange? That's almost like a cat peeking up under the door at you. It's weird.
I mean, she'd have to get down on her knees to peek.
Even lower than that, I would think.
Yeah. Lie down almost.
Yeah, she says, but I can't help myself. This language my body speaks as I crouch, palms, knees pressed against the prison floor.
You wonder why she is there. You know, there's a poem I love by Eldridge Knight. A lost woman visits a black junkie in prison. It's very different than this, but it's the same thing. You wonder, you know, in the Eldridge Knight poem, you can tell she's just a kind young woman who wants to do her, you know, community service kind of thing. But you don't know why this woman is there.
Well, I assume since she has a master's in divinity, that it, you know, maybe has something to do with
it. Yeah.
that mindset or that belief.
Prison ministry.
Ministry. Yeah, it's a better way to say that.
Yeah. Well, what did you think about, so that poem is This is Praying, and then there's, in the next section, there's 2 poems, This Too is Praying, and another attempt at praying.
Those are the 2 I liked the best, where this too is praying and another attempt at praying. I like both of those.
More flames on bottom of 66.
It's funny when you're writing poems, you don't realize that you use the same imagery. I'm like, I look at my collections now and I'm like, wow, how many times did I use that word? 50, you know, in every poem.
You can see it.
Yeah, she uses birds a lot. I have noticed in various poems, and definitely in the last one that we discussed.
Yeah,
And
the freedom there that in flight that she is longing for, I think, herself.
yeah,
Is had to hide for so long who she really is.
There's a lot of rain in her poems.
Yes. that
Calls to
too.
mind the effects of cleansing, in addition to putting out the flames that are also so prevalent in her poems.
Yeah, putting out the fires.
Mhm.
I think she had said in an interview that she had been reading a lot about rain.
Did you find the interview just by Googling her name? I didn't know about an interview.
She had it on her website.
Oh, okay.
It was a really in-depth interview with her.
Oh, cool. I'll go look at it.
Well, we can backtrack to page 16. Passing On, that's a poem that kind of got me into the book more so than others, where she finds notes and of plates and things that are passed on. And then in the end, she says, passed on until it opened out inside of me, falling out of hiding. And I think she's also talking about maybe her sexuality was passed on, because the father was saying in one of the poems, just like your mother.
Maybe your mother was too.
So
Yeah.
I found that very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I did too.
The two different meanings of passing on.
Yes. Yeah.
Really poignant that she found those notes in her mother's handwriting, you know, after like 6 years later.
Yeah, all of those poems in Holy Week,
Mm-hmm.
of which there are 7, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, are about her mother's death
Mhm.
and memories and that kind of thing.
And those are numbered also.
Yes.
I'm always kind of bemused by numbers, but yeah, these are numbered to make them all part of the whole.
Yeah. So also there was, I guess, alcoholism in this family,
Yeah.
which I thought Induction was an interesting poem too. On page 17. Which is interesting. What she received from her mother, you know, both of this potential queerness or not being able to be the authentic self, and also, I don't know, I'm not saying that Lisa has an alcohol problem, but apparently she she saw that growing up in all of these different bottles and hidden bottles and
Yeah, she called them jars, and that confused the heck out of me.
I was a little concerned about that too.
Well, what's the jars? Like,
Mason jars.
I wondered that too. Moonshine. Jars. Like she was hiding jars, or maybe just pouring the alcohol into jars so it wouldn't look like alcohol. I don't know what that.
Exactly.
But then it does say bottles of bourbon, and her favorite drink was a Manhattan. And those were all connected. So I like that. I like the way she did that, kind of in the middle of this book, to have a series of poems
And then I also like on page 67 in the last section, last poem about my mother. I think that's wonderful too. And it goes with kind of the other bird imagery poems.
Yeah, it's kind of like I'm finally okay with this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like the end. This is my mother and a way out of my mother, a place I can say that I left.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is also a birthing image as well.
Mm-hmm.
Which she says back in one of the beginning poems that it was like didn't she say like almost as if she birthed her mother? Where was that?
She does say that.
Oh, in intersection. When have you ever thought you might be, it wasn't an option, you said. And then at the end, but for the tiny part that broke out, sneaked out sly, the resounding yes of your seventh conception, as if I birthed you. So I read that as if she was the seventh child that was actually queer, that had that connection with her mom, who apparently was in the closet, I guess we would say.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
That's very interesting.
But yet her mother pushed her to conform.
Yeah.
As she had, but yet at the same time, to not would put you outside of society, you know? It's a lot of connections in that sense, mother and daughter.
I really like the matrimonies poems. I know that section, which is short, only 4 poems. Those were they were painful to read. You know, you could just feel that confusion and that loss of and hiding and being ashamed. And I thought those were poems I could really feel that pain that she wrote with in those.
What I liked about the book, that I thought there was a gradual revealing of her sexuality. It wasn't, suddenly, it was gradually told. And I like that about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after you've read the full book and you go back, you see even in the opening poems, well, in fact, the first poem, there's the Christmas pageant, but then there's the, what I think of, I've often wondered, was that a poem? The first section of that was a poem, and it was literally workshopped by somebody else, maybe even the famous poet that's on the elevator. And then there are, the second section kind of takes that up, which I thought was really fascinating. And then followed that by what I think of as one of the quietly kind of really genius poems of the book, the second one, For the Cashier at T.R. Wolfe's Toy and Candy, which might be a poem in fact, I think the first time I read it, when I got to the ending of it, it sent me back to reread it. And as I read it, it was sort of like, hey, I just read this poem, but I don't remember this. I'm a better reader than this. But as I read it, I thought, wow, this is a really wonderful poem. And there's especially the ending of it, which you see maybe as a kind of stand-in for the poet herself. And where she says, only this, the daily repetition of warm coins passing from our hand into hers. And how can I not admire her for her refusal to feign contentment? Whatever it was she wanted, getting us instead.
Yeah.
Or stand in for a mother. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's like the mother, except that the mother does feign contentment.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, there are ways that both of these poems at the beginning kind of have their tentacles out through, and the connections exist within other poems.
Well, what did you think about Elevator Ride with Famous Poet and the conjunctions of all the raining? It is raining, it has rained, it will have been raining.
Sounds like she's working on her Latin. That's what-
It's that leap of the father working on his car that I don't quite get, even though I love the image.
what page is it on?
7.
7 and 8.
Well, Linda, the part you're talking about, it's this language I was never expected to master, and the kind of implications of that, even throughout sexuality, even only to practice over that dense geography, the one small phrase taught to my tourist body, my tourist mind. And there's a lot of stuff in the book, obviously, about body and mind. Later, or was that one moment? Yeah, even in the last poem, even Houseflies, the beginning of it says, I did not know that their brains, if separated from the body, would resemble a single grain of sugar. You could say that, I mean, she is obviously a body, but she's this brain too that is thinking about the body, wrestling with and trying to come to terms with the body and all of its forms, even the 19-year-old body that's behind bars. So
Mhm.
but it is raining, it was raining, all that is, it's like, it's language. You're conjugating verbs, I guess.
Mm. Well, another poem that we haven't talked about that really got me with a punch, and it's literally a punch in the poem, and it's Flash on page 34 about her father, and it happened so subtly in the poem. You don't really know it's coming. You don't know. It's like you don't realize you've been hit in the poem. It's just an amazing thing, the way she works this in the poem, that her father was playfully kind of playing with her, and he hit her in the jaw. Is that what happened?
Oh.
This was one of the ones I thought was a private poem.
Yeah.
I felt like I couldn't get in. The frame was there, but I couldn't find the door for it.
I don't think he really hit her. I think in the photo, he's posed as if he were going to hit her. But, there's clearly an implication that there's more violence under the surface than this, playful pose allows.
Okay.
So they're dressed for a gathering of family. I never saw the fist, 27 tightly clenched bones flex playfully in my direction. I look happy, which is why I loved the picture for as long as I did. My father's right arm embracing me in the only way he knew, which I guess is the fist. And the fist, the way it hung there. In every room my father entered. Compressed regions of tendon storing the energy he was capable of releasing, but maybe did not release. My fear braided into the strands of sinew connecting good girl muscle to good girl bone, while meanwhile her mother is just touching the shutter with the one finger.
Okay. So it's like the possibility is there, but it didn't.
Yeah.
Actually.
It's like my Papa's Waltz, right? Where it's,
Right.
Back and forth, balance,
Oh,
balance.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm.
Well, did you notice any particular craft element that she used? We talked about some, I think, her leaps. She also used, I think, repetition a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of poems where there's a repetition of a phrase.
The history of rain, I think.
History of rain.
You ask how.
And then the poem, to say something is alive is not enough, which is a poem I wanted to like. And I don't feel I really got it all the way.
What page is that?
It's 45.
Well, it's got a great title.
I thought the way that this was written was very interesting because the sentences begin with because or and.
I love the line, and I don't know if memory is a place or a map of the place. I thought that was just beautiful. Well, that isn't the ending because it goes on to the next page, which I did not realize at first. The
Yes.
first time I read this, I stopped there. And then I reread it because, like Sandy, I was struggling a little bit with the poem, right? And then I realized, oh, that isn't the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did that too.
I flipped the page and I thought, she doesn't need that. I did back like, she doesn't need that. Those last 3 lines there.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment.
I like the line, and I did not know that loss could be so ordinary.
Yeah.
That was like, I gotta think about that. But isn't it interesting how this poem works with the ands and the because? To say something alive is not enough because da-da-da-da-da and da-da-da-da-da. I don't think I've ever seen that before.
Oh, well, yeah, I've seen lots of those poems that kind of have a refrain of because. Christina Olson.
Sounds like a MFA workshop type of exercise.
It's something, yeah, I see that. At least this one had a title that kind of explained because what. But there are a lot of poems which are just because I'm like, well, for the love of God, give me an independent clause here. Because this, then what? I was glad this one had a title.
Yeah. Is there a name for that? Or is it just
I have often wondered. Does anybody know?
Well, I don't know that there's a name for it, but I would put it under the heading of repetition and variation as a kind of conceptual strategy for shaping or generating the poem. I think my first recognition of something like this is like a 30-something-year-old poem, probably by now, by Richard Jackson, called "About the Dogs of Dachau." And every statement of the poem begins with the word "about." So it's a long catalog, and the only way that can work is if you vary the lengths of the duration of each statement, or you do some kind of interrupting phrases occasionally, and you make it work that way. But I mean, I see something like that structure quite often, but I would label it repetition and variation. Christina Olson, is a poet that I think her very first published poem in Mid-American Review many years ago is titled "I Keep Goldfish," because the clause says in its first in its first clause says no pets, because this, because that, and it's actually a pretty good poem, but it is a struggle to write something like that successfully, I think.
Yeah. And then in a lot of the poems, she repeats little phrases like in even houseflies. The repeated phrase, I think it's in there 3 times. And who's to say? And who's to say this? And who's to say this wasn't blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
So that's in several, like in 31, there's a repetition of the line's getting closer and closer. The line's getting closer and closer. In there 3 times as well. So there's like 6 or 7 poems that have some sort of repetition of a phrase and I like that.
Mm-hmm. Makes them lyrical.
It does.
Mm-hmm.
It also like builds a crescendo. You know, you imagine the lines getting closer, being read louder and louder every time. It does seem to build.
I also like her poem on page 62, What Eye Is This?, where she reveals the struggle with God or the quarrel that she has with God. And I think it comes through in other poems as well, not quite as vividly as in this one.
Yeah, that comes through in Commemoration too, right? The very first poem.
Okay.
Yeah. So I thought she was trying to come full circle there.
Yeah.
And with A Woman Dreams of Rain, that was in an early poem. So she's got that on 63, and that was in an early poem as well. So she is trying to pay attention to the order of the poems in the book.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think she's very careful with that, to follow the timeline or the arc. I think it works well.
Yeah. One thing I was reminded of with this particular poem is Ellen Bryant Voigt's. There's a book of hers. Is it Two Trees? Linda, you might help me out here. Or actually, it's probably on my shelf. I could probably grab it here. But she'd write a poem, and then there'd be like another version of that poem that would follow it. If I'm remembering correctly here. I don't know if I've got this. Yeah. Two Trees. Y'all know this book? Ellen Bryant Voigt.
Really not.
I know Voight, but I don't have that book.
92. I think it's this book where she does. It's almost like variations. She'd write a poem, and then there'd be a variation of that same poem, and maybe the commemoration poem. Although I don't really see that second section of that as a variation on the first one necessarily, but maybe with this particular one that we're discussing, What Eye Is This? Because it has some of the same language in it as the first one does. But I think that I often try to think of what shapes a poet's particular mind. You know, like the way we might talk about V. Wallace Szymborska or Whitman as primarily catalog poets. They think through catalog, or Philip Levine as a narrative poet or whatever. But what is Lisa here? I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I do think that she thinks in terms of sequence. she has more than one kind of sequence type poem, and even the ones that aren't. I mean, there's obviously Holy Week, which I think is a wonderful sequence of poems. I don't normally do this. This is not how well, actually, I guess I did once. Now that I say I don't do this, my book of sonnets, I have a sequence. They're all individual sonnets, but I put them together in a sequence. But it's not normally how I would write a poem or think about writing a poem. But I think, well, that'd be something maybe to ask her, whether she thinks in terms of sequences of poems that all communicate with one another, or kind of take on a larger project and then expand it toward something, as a kind of shaping device for the poems. And from a craft perspective, Sandy, that would be maybe something that stands out to me about this book.
Mm-hmm. I think that's always a tough one. They often, unless you really sit down to write your book of poems about Admiral Byrd or something, they're all one-offs until they're not. And then you have to either find or create or imagine this arc between them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes they seem like, what is it? Linda Paston, I think, has done it. Maybe Yusef Kamanyaka have both written sequence poems about the 7 deadly sins. So that each one is given its own title, but it's part of a larger sequence of poems. But I mean, how many of us actually set out to write a sequence? It might be something we could learn, or bring to our own projects.
I thought more of her individual poems were lyric and that there was an elliptical quality to them, which is, I think, what you all are talking about with leaps, that conceptually they were somewhat elliptical. But like you say, I do think some of it hinges on very private information in her life that we don't always have full access to. But I thought there was a lot of connectivity between her poems for sure. Like you're talking about in the macro sense in the book. Lots of, it almost felt like it looped back very frequently, even among the sections. So.
Yeah, it makes me kind of wonder if, farther down the path of, and I don't know what the gestational period was for this particular book. I mean, between when it was written and when it was published, that could be a decade, who knows?
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised if she turns out to be a poet driven by metaphor, in the sense that sometimes when, like, say, the poem that I mentioned early on for the cashier at T.R. Wolf's Toy and Candy, that's a poem that actually teaches us how to read other poems.
Yeah.
And maybe as her writing develops, and all of that, as we all hope that ours does, that I think she's already conscious of a poem next to another poem. These are not just individual poems, but you can't read the second poem except through the lens of the first one you just read. And there are enough of those times in this book that I seem to be aware of that. But I wonder if that's kind of something that is going to be maybe even more developed in a future book.
We'll have to ask her what she has coming up next.
The feeling that I got, and I don't know if I'm projecting from my own life, but it feels to me like she's moving through the book toward more understanding of her childhood, of her parents, toward compassion, toward that cleansing that someone mentioned, which I love, the idea of cleansing and rain together. It feels that she's working bit by bit toward that, or more of that through the book. more grace, more, I don't know if forgiveness is the word or compassion, but it feels a little like that to me, which is good. I think that's a good thing. That's what I try to do in my own work usually.
Maybe that's the thousands and thousands of eyes at the end of the book, which is almost I don't want to say omniscient view, but a much more, well, not singular, obviously not a singular, only one way to look at something or to interpret something. And so that, I mean, it makes me think of Mary Oliver's 1,000 faceted eyes that she talks about in some of her own poems, which is the kind of perhaps abundance. I mean, the divinity kind of aspect of this, or from her background, come that you would have life and have it more abundantly. Maybe some of that abundance is the ability to see things from so many possibilities, so many views, which would then create understanding or empathy, perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, it wraps around to the concept of the Mosaic, the title of the book.
Yeah.
Well, if we were going to ask Lisa to read a poem, which one should we ask her to read?
I think we should ask her first, what's the poem that she mostly goes to herself when she gives a reading, and then, maybe steer away from that one.
Read one that you don't usually read.
Yeah.
I bet she goes for that last one. And I hadn't really thought about the thousand-eyed perspective. I thought maybe she ended there because it's so pretty, and yeah, but maybe a different one would be a better choice.
This is Praying, the one about speaking to the 19-year-old.
Yeah, I like this too is Praying. I like that one.
I do too.
Let's ask her who the famous poet in the elevator was.
Oh yeah, gotta know.
It might turn out to be Linda Parsons.
No.
Oh, sure.
I, of course, thought it was Wendell Berry because I once rode an elevator with Wendell Berry. So, I just realized that that's exactly what I filled in the blank with.
Yeah. I got in the elevator with William Stafford. And I said, I bet you're William Stafford. He said, yes, how did you know? I said, because you're so ordinary looking. You don't look like a poet at all. And I said, hope you don't mind me saying that. He said, oh, no, I'll take it as a compliment.
I was on the elevator once with Jerry Reed that sang Pope Salad Annie. I was on the elevator with him.
Okay, well, hopefully she'll show up.
Yeah.
8 o'clock. Okay, there she is.
All right. Hello, Lisa.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
How are all of you? Hi, Sandy. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, thank you for joining us.
And Linda. Yeah, well, you're so welcome.
We've just been discussing your book for the last hour.
Oh my gosh.
And if you don't mind, we'd like to ask you a few questions, and then maybe at the end you could read a poem.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Jeff, would you ask her what you were talking about, the sequence?
Yeah, I forget what my question would be, but I was noticing, for instance, that, like the first poem has a section 1 and a section 2, and then there's the Holy Week. And then later there's another poem that has a first and a second section. And do you set out to write a sequence poem, or is that more of something that you gather later and then kind of impose that structure? We were kind of talking about just elements of craft that we notice. We do this with every book we do in this book club, but we ask ourselves questions about craft, things that stand out to us. And just thinking about the sequence as a frame for a poem.
And I know you mentioned commemoration, and then are you also talking about the bird? But what eye is this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the mother poems. Yeah, that's interesting, and I would say it's different for all three of those sequences. How it happened. With the commemoration poem, that first part I thought was actually the poem.
The poem? Okay.
I thought it was done, and then this was probably it was before I entered the MFA program, but I was auditing classes, and I brought it to this workshop I was auditing, and that person who, it's not anyone affiliated with Vanderbilt, it was a visiting person, in a lot of ways kind of gave me the second half of that poem, which is really interesting and significant considering what the poem is about.
Right.
So that was something, yeah, I certainly didn't set out to write kind of a sequence about that. And the same is true with the What I Is This, with the two different poems, one in the first person and one in the third person. And that was actually a really interesting process. I for several nights in a row, I kept dreaming of a flock of birds. I just kept seeing a flock of birds in my dream. That was the entire dream. And I finally decided to look up the word flock, because I thought, surely the universe is telling me something. So I looked up the word flock, and I was shocked at how many other words there are for flock, and how sort of deeply theological a lot of those words are. And so I wrote that first part of it, number one, twice now I've dreamed of birds. And I was happy with it, but I kept going back to the fact that I felt like I was almost making too much of a statement about God, as God becomes the quarrel, which is another word for a kind of flock, becomes confusion, dissent. I thought there's not enough sort of humility and questioning in here. Like, here I am, this human being, describing God with this capital G and saying this is what's happening. And so I decided I wanted to back off from that a little bit, and I wrote the same poem but from the perspective of third person, and I just made it a little bit less definitive. And at first I thought, well, maybe this is the poem, and then I decided I really liked both of them together, because as human beings, we are trying. I mean, if people who are in a religious tradition, or who are religious or spiritual, in some ways are desperately trying to make some kind of claim. Like, it's almost human nature, but there's also this this mix of
this quarrel.
The quarrel, exactly. So then I thought they really do belong together because it gets at that, well, at the struggle that I feel all the time, like say something definitive about the divine, can't really do that, but I'm gonna do it anyway, can't do that, and that kind of back and forth. So that's how that sequence came to be. And then I think you mentioned the mother poems, and those were all separate poems at first. Like I certainly didn't set out to write, okay, I'm gonna write 7 mother poems.
Yeah.
And it turns out though, and of course I have other mother poems too, but first they were separate poems, and I just decided they all kind of hang together, and what a perfect number for a sequence, 7, especially when one of the poems is called Holy Week. So so in any rate, but back to the craft question, yeah, none of this is anything I set out with. It's a whole process of discovery.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and then there's the way as well that, I mean, we might be justified in thinking of those as sequence poems, but the entire book is a sequence. And so one poem, as I was talking earlier, one poem teaches us how to read the next one. And sometimes the
Right.
juxtapositions of poems in the book are really kind of wonderful, wonderful moments. I mean, each poem is by itself a standalone thing, but when you read them side by side, I think we're all kind of going for that, right? I mean, it's like,
right.
That would be a wonderful next poem to follow.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I remember I really struggled with ordering the poems, and I basically started sending this manuscript out way before I really needed to, or should have. And it was a different order every time, and it took me a while to come up with this order, and then once I did, it just felt right. But you're right, like every poem you read, you're going to read the next poem through the lens of that first one. And towards the end, there are those 2 prison poems. And I remember meeting with someone at, I don't even remember who it was, but someone at Sewanee. And I said, well, I was thinking of starting, or so I asked him something about these 2 poems, and he said, and I had already decided I wanted to start with those 2 prison poems in the manuscript. And he said, well, now you wouldn't want to start with those 2 prison poems, because then it just changes the focus of the whole manuscript. And I wanted to start with something that's really a poem that's really going to be speaking to the whole manuscript, about the patriarchal culture, and kind of trying to find a voice within it. But really putting the order together is very similar, I found, to the writing process itself, because I felt like I discovered things along the way.
Well, Lisa, we really liked the poems in the This Is Praying section about the river bend security. And we were thinking that was probably like a ministry that you were doing because of your divinity, or?
Yes, it was through, so I'd go to the First Unitarian Universalist Church, and we had a prison ministry for a number of years. It's no longer really up and running, and not just because of COVID, but yeah, we went once a month on Friday night and led a Unitarian Universalist service. And then we also had an opportunity to deliver Christmas presents, which was really just like candy bars. And I mean, we weren't allowed to bring in presents. It was what the prison decided. But we did that right before Christmas. So that was, both of those poems grew out of one of them in particular grew out of a very kind of one-on-one interaction with one of the residents. The other one is a little bit more of a collage where everything happened, but it didn't happen exactly that way. But it happens that way in the poem. You know, it becomes its own narrative then.
Right. And then I was interested also in, so this is praying, and then in the next section, there is, this too is praying.
Yeah.
Another attempt at praying.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit about that? About what are you accomplishing? I mean,
So
I
think
that, but I want to hear from you.
So I think one thing that's going on in this book is sort of just from a faith or spiritual perspective is trying to make sense of, you know, where do I fit into this? I'm just going to say I instead of speaker, but fit into this very patriarchal religion, not wanting to leave everything behind. So I think as the poems progress, there ends up being, and this parallels my own journey, obviously, a more of a mystical understanding of the divine, or a you know, less tied to the traditions that I or the speaker grew up with. So, and I feel like that just kind of happened naturally as I was writing this book. And I knew, even though I struggled with how to order some of the poems in the beginning, I definitely knew what to put at the end, because it felt like I was moving in that direction very much, in this very kind of linear but circular way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that, you know, that interest in the divine and spirituality is definitely, I mean, it's a huge interest. It's a huge interest, and it connects so much to the writing process as well. They're both sort of interconnected, and the poems in the manuscript I'm working on now very much pick up that same thread of, you know, asking about divinity. What does it mean to even think about divinity, and all those sorts of questions.
Well, that was one question we were going to ask you, is what are you doing next? So I'm glad to hear there's another book in process.
I do, yeah, I do. It's actually completed, and I've been sending it out. I started sending it out this summer, and I have a, without giving too many details, I mean, yeah, without giving too many details, I do have a tentative yes, and I'm just waiting to hear from a couple other places, which was okay with the people who gave me the yes. So I should be able to sign the contract in a couple weeks. I mean, nothing really happens at this time of year, it seems like, but hopefully in January. But yeah, I'm very excited about that. And the process for putting that book together was totally different from this process, I think, because it was my first book. It kind of coincided with getting the MFA. It was just such a long process, and it took a while for me to find my footing as a poet. I mean, all of this was very late in life for me. I didn't go to get my MFA until I was 45. So even though I had been writing on and off for years, it really, all of this came together very late in life. But the second manuscript, it just was much, I guess, fewer labor pains is how I would say it. I mean, it just, not that it happened easily, but it just felt different.
Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing that.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? Poets.
I was going to circle back to something you said earlier, Lisa, on page 50 in the poem, The Lies That Save Us.
Uh-huh.
You, toward the very end of that poem, you say, we smile back knowing the power of things unseen, which is that, has that echo of faith being, you know,
Right.
and atoms, quarks, and auras, and all the love that lies between, kissing energy, we call it. But all they can see is something, which is a really interesting ending as well. It makes me think of the, who was asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And I think they're like a way that that's twisted around as the evidence of God or whatever.
Oh, that's great.
So that maybe is, you talked about moving through the book toward, you know, something, and you weren't exactly saying, but it's faith, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so that power of something that's unseen, which is, I mean, the poem itself emerging out of nothingness is this kind of faith that something is going to be there as opposed to nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's so vague and enough at the same time. I mean, something doesn't really, not very specific, but it's, I mean, from my perspective, it's just a glorious word, you know, because it is something. And then of course this arises out of I mean, it's in conversation with a biblical story. And so there's that sense of, you know, me or the speaker kind of re-envisioning that tradition or coming up with a way in which, or starting to see a way in which that tradition can make sense to the speaker in a way it didn't before.
We also noticed there are a couple of, I don't know what you call them, not really themes really, but things like birds appear a lot in the poems, rain appears a lot.
Yeah.
You talk about symbolism, about what is the rain coming up again and again in these poems. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, both of those things do come up a lot, birds and rain. And I would say, I mean, birds are they're just a great symbol of things, something that's there and not there, here 1 minute, you know, that a symbol for kind of flight and something you can't really ground and contain, like the spirit. And then the rain, I would say, is I mean, something I'm just drawn to, maybe because it often symbolizes, people always sort of think of it as something that symbolizes sadness. And that is a part of life in some ways. I mean, the joy and the despair go hand in hand in so many ways. And there's room, you know, for both of those in a good life. But I also just love this idea that, like, when it rains, people always talk about it. You know, it's like, how can you not? It's something that connects people. Like, you know, when it's pouring rain and you walk into a store, people are going to talk about the fact that, oh, it's raining. You know, I didn't know this was in the weather. It's just something you talk about. And then when you think about that in terms of as being almost a metaphor for just the stuff of life that we experience. Yeah. The good stuff and the bad stuff. I don't know if that really, I mean,
you know, Lisa, as you're talking, it makes me also think of that, you know, your sexuality that you talk about it within this book, you know, nice sunny weather is the norm.
Right.
And the rain is not the norm. Yeah. And I don't know if that has anything to do with this either, but you know, that would be an interesting exploration
Right.
in writing about this book, because that, like you're talking about, people talk about it.
Yeah.
They note it,
Right.
which we do. I mean, we tend to note difference.
Yes, exactly.
We can't just say, you know, my friend. We say, you know, my African American friend or whatever. It's like we always do stuff like that, just because it's become the habit of how we speak.
And we don't see as readily the majority kind of
Yeah.
the norm, the quote unquote norm. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely.
Which the first poem in the book deals with that.
Hmm.
You know, just, you know, talk about the desire. And
Right.
I just think
Right.
it's that was a great choice for the first poem in this book. I thought
Thank you.
the deeper I think about it, the more I think it's just a great choice.
But we also
Thank
talked
you.
about rain as, I think someone mentioned, I can't remember who now, in connection with cleansing,
Uh-huh.
with being washed. Well, I can't remember even what poem it was that we were talking about. That was it, The History of Rain?
Oh, so the history of rain, I had read a book about, part of it was about how gendered even the discussion of rain has been, you know, in a variety of cultures, so that a hard rain it was called a male rain, you know, a soft kind of misty rain was a female rain. And I remember when I read about that, I thought, gosh, even rain is gendered. And just how problematic, but also really fascinating. Oh, and the elevator poem has rain. Yeah, oh my gosh, it is everywhere. Yeah, so I think that was part of my fascination too, that it hasn't always just been rain. And then I think that history of rain was also about, you know, the things that I don't remember what page it's on, but
64. The History of Rain is on page 64, if that's what you're looking for.
64?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Just kind of the relationship between, you know, societies and the weather, that oftentimes early on it was, you know, people had to sort of try to appease the gods if there was bad weather. I mean, there's this big relationship, you know, with certain kinds of weather being thought of as divine punishment. So there's all of that kind of figures into this poem as well, that sort of human relationship and human struggle with the divine and the presence of the divine. And yes, and the mountains that can stop the rain. Yeah, absolutely. There is an awful lot of rain. You know, years ago I heard Claudia Emerson read, who, you know, is no longer living, but she, and I can't remember which book this was, but she sent it to her editor, and her editor said, you know, there's a lot of fire in here, there's a lot of heat in here. And she said, oh, well, I am going through menopause. and she, it was just such a funny moment, because she didn't really realize why there was so much of that. And maybe that wasn't the reason, but the point is there was this sort of connection between what her body was experiencing internally and what she was writing externally. So, I mean, I do love rain, and I think, and this kind of goes back to sort of that element of like the mood of rain, that I feel like sometimes on a really sunny day, you almost, there's this expectation that you're going to be happy.
Right.
Whereas, and you almost, that you have to be happy, but when it's raining, it's like, you know, maybe that just suits, I mean, I'm very joyful, but I also have a depressive side, and maybe it just suits that part of me.
Right. Well, we were curious who was the famous poet in the elevator.
In the elevator poem, that was Philip Levine.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
Yes, and just the backstory was that this was at Chicago, the AWP in Chicago. I don't know when that was, like 6 or 7 years ago. And I got onto the elevator, and you know, I see his author photos on books, but oftentimes authors will use like a much older photo, you know, rather than one that's more recent. So I got on the elevator, and I thought, this guy looks like Philip Levine. I couldn't see his name tag, and all these other people were on the elevator too, and no one was saying anything. And finally, Philip Levine said, "You all must be fiction writers," you know, because he was kind of annoyed that we hadn't noticed him. And at that point, I realized, I literally turned to him and said, "Oh my God, are you Philip Levine? Because I just love you." But I just loved that moment of like, almost like he needed us as much as we needed him. You know, that there was something so, I felt like something that symbolizes the writing process, which is, you know, we need our readers need us, kind of thing.
right. Yeah. Cool. Well, when you read from this book, what is one poem that you always go to? Is there a poem that you always read?
Answer cautiously.
What? Wait, say that again.
You said
Answer cautiously.
Oh.
It's a trick question.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I do often or always really read 6th grade, and I often or always read mother poems. I don't know. Do you have one in particular I should read?
We thought you probably always read the last poem, Even Houseflies, because it has the title in it.
Oh.
But no, you don't typically read that one?
No, I do. I do read this often. Yes. No, you're absolutely right. It's usually the last poem I read, because then I say, and that's the title of the book.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, but it was kind of a tricky question, because if I'm only reading one poem, I don't know if I necessarily
would pick that
one. But if I'm doing a whole sequence, yeah.
Well, we thought we didn't want you to read the poem that you always read. So
that's fair.
We were thinking maybe you could read This Is Praying for us, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
It's on 53.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. This is Praying. I hear a voice speaking about a bird dragging its dark universe of feathers across our yard, and I realize it must be me, telling the boy how I carried its body beyond the range of our dogs, one eye round as a coin, fixing fear upon me, the other half shut, how the bird hauled its body back into our yard, dying with a will I could only admire, telling the boy just to tell him something. I can barely see his face through the slot, 8 inches from the bottom of the door, pie hole they call it. I know he cannot be cured of his crime, but I can't help myself. This language my body speaks as I crouch, palms, knees pressed against the prison floor. Am I the bird? The boy asks. He is 19. He has an aunt, a mother, both illiterate, both 100 miles away. No one knows why they have stopped visiting. I imagine his body each Sunday learning again of their absence. I imagine his organs, his bones liquefying inside of his skin. I imagine his eyes staring out from his own gathered flesh. It is 3 days before Christmas, and I have 10 minutes to spread something like joy. I think of Vermeer, the woman in blue refusing to obey the physics of light. I do not even know the source of my own voice. Am I the bird? There is a window beyond the canvas, but Vermeer thinks a shadow will be distracting. I tell him, the boy, about a dream I'd had, how my mind had been like a living thing nailed down, trembling with what ifs and how comes, and then these words, I hear you breathing, a sound coming from within and beyond, not a voice exactly, more like a gentle pressing of heat, the perfect distance from flame, settling me immediately into sleep. And now this voice telling him I hear him breathing, telling him it is a beautiful sound.
That's a beautiful poem.
Thank you. I noticed I used something twice.
Mhm.
And it is a very I mean there's that mystical experience that happens at the end, which I think connects well with the word something. Like sometimes things happen and all you can say is it was something.
Right, yeah. Well, Lisa, thank you for joining us.
You're so welcome.
And
Thank you for having me, and thank you for reading the book.
we enjoyed it very much.
You're
And we look
welcome.
forward to your next one whenever it comes out.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We'll say good night then.
Okay,
Good
good
night.
night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
So I'm going to tell the rest of everybody that our January book is Faithful and Virtuous Night by Louise Gluck.
Okay.
On it. So she was the Nobel Prize winner. So this book is
I think it's 2014.
14, yeah.
Yeah, which is, you know, in terms of an individual collection, it's her most recent. But since she won the Nobel, we had been talking about that as, I don't know how many of you are familiar with her work or read her work.
I love her so much.
Yeah, that's a strong book.
Who wrote this? I didn't hear. Who wrote this?
Louise
book?
Gluck.
Louise
Glick,
Louise Gluck.
Gluck.
Louisa Gluck?
Yeah.
Yes, Louise.
Okay.
Lisa.
I thought, did we do this one already, or did I order this one and this wasn't for this book club? Borrowing. Catherine Moore.
We're not doing that one.
Okay.
I know Catherine Moore though.
Yeah.
I don't have that book. I need to get that book. And our February book. Now, Jeff, what was it?
Matthew Lipman.
Matthew Lipman, mesmerizingly something.
Mesmerizingly beautiful, sad. Hold on. I always forget the title. It's kind of a strange title. Mesmerizingly, sadly beautiful. 3 words. Mesmerizingly, sadly beautiful.
Beautiful. Matthew Lipman.
Okay.
Everybody have a good holidays and a Merry Christmas.
You
Yeah.
too.
You too.
You too.
All right. So I'm going to post the dates and the books on Facebook. I might just send an email to the email group too, just so you'll have all those, but you can start with those. And we'll get the dates to you too, so you can put it on your calendar. All right.
Great.
And then, I think for March, you were going to do Kate Daniels.
I know I couldn't remember the names of the books, so I was
Yeah.
just
So,
and
yeah, Kate's most recent book from LSU Press. What's the title? I'm suddenly going blank on it myself. In the recovery room.
Recovery of My Son or something like that, or I'll find the exact title and the publisher and get it all.
Yeah, in the months of my son's recovery.
Okay. That'll be March.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have April's too, but I can't remember the name of